And let's discuss this further with George Galloway, former British Member of Parliament and host of the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the program, sir. First of all, what was your initial reaction to the Ukrainian attack on a school dormitory in the Lugansk Republic?
Well, it was murder most foul. It was an act of terrorism, even by today's standards, of particular viciousness, bestiality. 18 little girls and 3 boys, 21 dead, dozens wounded, children lying under the rubble. It's the kind of thing that Israel has been doing in Gaza and now in Lebanon. It's the kind of thing that the Hitlerites commonly did in the course of the Second World War. And you would have expected any decent person, any right-thinking person, to condemn it unequivocally. The reaction from the Western media, though, and from at least Macron, I haven't seen any other Western statesman react, is to blame the victim, to blame Russia for retaliating for an act of terrorism so vast and so vile that any government in the world would have been forced to respond to it in precisely the way that Russia has done.
You know, the BBC and CNN have refused even to visit the site of the attack, and that's as Kiev is saying it's somehow a fabrication by Russia. Now, those two Western news agencies don't want to see the site firsthand, but why do you think?
Well, the BBC are, of course, busy in Moscow trying to foment problems there. That's their role. They're not a journalistic organization. They are an arm of the British state, which is otherwise engaged in this whole Ukraine story on every level, from the manufacture of weapons, from the supplying of intelligence, from the supply of experts, and who knows, even perhaps forces themselves. So it should not surprise you if the BBC, which is of course a British state mouthpiece, does not want to have its narrative compromised. Because if they went there, they'd have to report it. And if they reported it, it would give the lie to the British narrative, which is that the terrorists are Russia and the regime in Kiev are the victims of terrorism, when, of course, in this case, it's entirely the other way around.
And what about the CNN? Aren't they supposed to be an independent, impartial news network?
Well, I understand they said they were on vacation. But I assure you, if there had been an event in Moscow that they felt they could profit from, the vacations would all have been cancelled. These people are, I hate to use this word, it's a strong word, these people are prostitutes. They are whores for power, although whores have rather more honor than those who call themselves journalists and broadcasters in the so-called mainstream media in the West today.
And how would you compare the way that the Western media covered the strike on that dormitory and the retaliatory strikes on Kiev?
Well, Macron actually condemned the retaliatory strike without reference to what it was a retaliation for. How's that? Ooh la la for French hypocrisy. And as far as I can see, the other Western statesmen have said nothing at all. But the result is that their own people lose faith in them, and they lose any credibility that they have ever had, because on social media there is wall-to-wall coverage of this great crime in Lugansk. Everybody in the world who is not relying on a box in the corner with last century's technology, everybody who knows how to switch on a smartphone or a computer already knows about the evil of slaughtering 21 kids in their sleep, in their college. Everyone knows it. And when they don't see it on the so-called mainstream Western television stations, they don't hear it on their radio, they don't read it in their newspapers, this just further contributes to the death of this so-called mainstream media. After all, if your media isn't telling you what's actually happening and allowing you to make up your mind, what's the point of buying it? What's the point of consuming it? And fewer people are doing so.
Of course, you mentioned that a rather awkward statement by Macron, but also there's another one from the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and she said, quote, "Terror against civilians is not strength, it's despair," referring to Russian strikes on Kiev and not to the Ukrainian strikes on Starobelsk. So according to the EU, Ukraine is allowed to kill civilians and not be reprimanded?
Or not even be reported as having done so. I mean, we have suffered terrorism in France, in Belgium, in Britain. Terrorism is something that right-thinking people have to condemn wherever it happens, whomsoever it happens against, whoever is the perpetrator. That's the only moral and indeed logical thing to do when incidents of terrorism of this kind. You can't condemn terrorists on London Bridge, but not in a dormitory, murdering children, students in Lugansk, pretend it didn't happen, not even report it. What kind of hypocrisy is this? But you mentioned von der Leyen. At least Macron's an elected representative. Right. Who elected her? Who elected Callas to speak for the people of Europe on foreign policy? Who elected these people? The answer is no one. Who can remove them? The answer is no one. The European Union is becoming like the Soviet Union without the socialism.
And regarding that attack again, I know it's impossible to get in the heads of the people who actually made that decision, but Ukraine claims the Lugansk Republic is its own territory, and in fact, some of the people killed or injured in that strike were Ukrainian speakers, and they used to live under Kiev's rule. Why do you think Ukraine would try to kill those people?
Well, that's another of the paradoxes in this story. They claim this territory is theirs. They claim these citizens are their citizens, and so they murder them. But I must remind the viewers, they've been doing that since 2014. There were thousands of people who were murdered and maimed by the very government in Kiev that claimed they were their citizens in the course of the post-coup aggression against eastern Ukraine. Thousands. I think 14,000 people were killed by Kiev, and many thousands more were wounded. And the Western media had nothing to say about that either. So the paradox of arming, funding, and diplomatically protecting and shilling for a regime that is slaughtering people it claims to be its own people is a paradox on a whole other level.
In fact, right after the attack on the dormitory, we heard from Vasily Nebenzia, the permanent representative of Russia at the UN, who said that it's attacks like that one that were one of the main reasons for the special military operation in Ukraine, because civilians have been dying throughout all these years, as you've just mentioned, in these huge numbers, and no one likes to talk about it, even now when it's presented and evidence is presented at the United Nations, and it all again leads us to the media, specifically Western media, and they say 4 people were killed in the Russian retaliatory strikes on Ukraine. Okay, but that's more than 5 times the amount of people who were killed in Ukraine strikes on the dormitory in the Lugansk Republic. What do you think about those different casualty rates?
Well, of course, this entire conflict has cost the lives perhaps of millions of people, which is why people like me were opposing war in Ukraine from the very beginning, from 2014. We said that this Western coup d'etat in Kiev would be followed by war, war, and more war. And so it has happened. And instead of trying to bring an end to the war, as to his credit, at least rhetorically, the American president is trying to do, the European leaders are doing everything that they can to keep the war going. Imagine people that call themselves liberals and social democrats, even socialists in Europe, in government, are trying their best to stop a right-wing Republican president in the United States from bringing about peace in Europe. You really couldn't make this up. I know this is an era of cross-dressing, but this is political cross-dressing on a whole other scale.
You know, another interesting aspect to the story is that shortly before the attack on the dormitory, Alex Karp, the CEO of AI warfare company Palantir, visited Kiev and met personally with Zelensky, and they spoke about how important technology is for the Ukrainian military and the accuracy of Ukrainian attacks. But do you think that has any connection with what happened recently with the drone strike on the school?
Well, it may very well do, but I have to tell you that I think this strike on the dormitory was extremely accurate. I think it was entirely deliberate. They deliberately targeted these children in this dormitory. It was a deliberate act of mass murder. It was therefore a war crime, a crime against humanity, and it must be prosecuted as such in time to come. So I don't think there was anything accidental. I think Palantir can, in his twisted, perverse way, consider it a job well done. You tried to murder all these children and you succeeded in doing so. So the issue of whose weapons are they? Well, we know who is supplying these weapons. And it would be entirely within Russia's rights to retaliate against those who are making these strikes into Russia possible. And they're now talking about missiles, a joint British-German missile. Little Macron is trying to get in on the act, which will penetrate far deeper into Russia. So it would be entirely within Russia's rights of self-defense to take action against the people who are making all of this possible. And who knows who did the targeting? My suspicion is obvious from the stance that I am taking. What I do know is that much of the striking of civilian and civilian infrastructure targets in Russia are being directed by foreign hands, NATO hands. NATO is up to its neck in the blood of these schoolgirls, in the blood of these students. Of that, I am absolutely certain.
All right, George Galloway, former British Member of Parliament and host of the Mother of All talk shows. Thank you so much for finding the time and sharing your thoughts with us.
Welcome.